Good morning, Professor Zinn.
Good morning.
First question. I'd like you to tell our audience a little bit about the piece that appeared in the Boston Globe Sunday, January 8th, 1993, I believe, that you entitled What Good Old Days?
Oh, now I have to remember what I wrote. Well, I was responding to a piece by George Will, who is syndicated and whose column appeared in the Boston Globe, and he was quoting some conservative politico who said something about going back to 1900, and the idea was that, since 1900, things have gone downhill. The reason things have gone downhill since 1900 is because we've had all this welfare, all this reform legislation. The government has stepped in and done all these things, Social Security and aid to families of dependent children and so on. And the idea was, and you hear this a lot, go back to the old days of laissez-faire, the old days of small government.
Self-sufficiency.
And rugged individualism. And I don't remember exactly what I wrote in my piece, but my guess is that I wrote about what things really were like before 1900, or before all this, welfare legislation. What things were like in that glorious time of laissez-faire when we didn't have, according to them, a big government. And I talked about how people worked 12 hours a day and 14 hours a day and 6 days a week and 7 days a week, and girls went to work in the textile mills of Lowell and at the age of 11 and died at the age of 25, and how the immigrants were pouring into the cities in the late 19th century and living in, we know the city's slums are bad today. They were even worse then. There was no clean water. Kids died of typhoid, and in the summer kids died in the heat. In the winter people froze to death, and there was no workman's compensation. There's no Social Security, no unemployment insurance. You were on your own. Wonderful free enterprise system, and so I think that's what I was talking about in my column. This issue of big government is really an intriguing one because there's so much hypocrisy in it. I said a minute ago that the so-called era of little government, in the good old days, the truth is we have never had anything but big government in the United States. This country was founded on big government. The Constitution of the United States set up big government. That was the whole idea of the Constitution. The idea is to get rid of the little governments or their power, which under the Articles of Confederation there was a very weak central government. The states had all the power, but the states were incapable of controlling rebellions that were going on. And here in Massachusetts, in western Massachusetts, there was Shays' Rebellion. Where these farmers who had their farms taken away from them and their land taken away from them because they couldn't pay pay off their loans. They organized, led by Captain Daniel Shays. They marched on the courthouses. They wouldn't let the courts meet to take away their farms. It was turned into a real rebellion again and again all over western Massachusetts, Springfield, Northampton, Amherst. And Shays' Rebellion put a very deep scare into the founding fathers, and the letters flew back and forth saying, "Hey, what are we going to do about this?" Because it wasn't easy to quell. They had to raise money from the rich merchants of Boston to raise the army that put down Shays' Rebellion. Now, if they had a strong federal government, they wouldn't have to resort to private enterprise to raise the money. Federal taxation would be enough You'd have an army, you'd have a military power, and you could quickly move the troops in. So the Constitution was set up for the purpose of having a strong government which would do the following things. It would protect the slave owners from slave revolts. Otherwise, the slave owners were on their own, had to work it out themselves. No, now you had a federal constitution and a clause written into the Constitution saying that if any slave moves from the South into free territory, it's the job to return them to the rightful owner. Slave owners needed protection. The Western land expansionists and speculators needed protection against the Indians because they were moving into Indian territory, and the Indians, for some reason, wanted to resist, and so they needed you needed an army to do that. The budding manufacturing industry in the United States needed tariffs for protectionism. The bondholders who were holding the bonds that had been given out during the Revolutionary War, they wanted their money back. They wanted their bonds redeemed. If you didn't have a strong federal government, they wouldn't get their bonds. So the new federal government was set up to do all of that. And in fact, as soon as the government was instituted, the very first thing that happened was Alexander Hamilton presents his economic program to Congress. And what does his economic program call for? It calls for paying off the bondholders. It calls for a protectionist tariff. It calls for an alliance with the banks by setting up a national bank and giving the government money into the banking system. And it taxes, not the rich, it taxes the farmers so they can pay for all of this. So the Constitution set up big government. And that big government operated exactly in the way that they wanted it to operate. That is, that army that now could be sustained by federal taxation throughout the 19th century moved across the West and destroyed the Indian civilizations. In the middle of the Civil War, interestingly enough, more land was taken from the Indians during the Civil War than at any other point in American history. When we read histories of the Civil War, it's all about Gettysburg and Antietam and Bull Run and all of that. But the Army was doing more than that. It was not just fighting the Confederates. The Army was out west massacring the Shoshone Indians in Utah, massacring, the Indians in Colorado, and clearing the West for what? For the railroads, for the corporations. And talking about the railroads, in the 1850s, the state governments gave 20 million acres of land free to the railroads. In the 1860s, the federal government gave about 100 million acres of land free to the railroads. I would call that welfare. Big, big welfare. Not little welfare. Not aid to families with dependent children, but aid to the rich in a big way. So we've always had big government, subsidies to the manufacturers, to the corporations. This new discovery about corporate welfare, it's as if it's a new phenomenon. That's all we've had all through American history is corporate welfare. And it was interesting. In 1932, Charles Beer, the great historian, wrote an article, 31, I think, wrote an article. We historians are very particular about who cares, right? Who cares? Was it 31, 32? No, we insist it's 31. Charles Beer wrote an article for Harper's Magazine, and the myth of rugged individualism. And because in 1931, we were going into this deep, deep depression right after the crash of 29. And some people saying, hey, the government should help people. People are desperate. But the others were saying, no, what about rugged individualism? Let people do it on their own. Let them take care of themselves. And Beard wrote this essay, The Myth of Rugged Individualism, in which he gave the history of all these subsidies that have been given to the rich, to the merchant marine, to subsidies. And it continued it has continued all through American history. Oil depletion allowance to the oil companies. After World War II, the aircraft industries, all these big, we know billion-dollar aircraft industries, they were collapsed. The whole aircraft industry had nowhere to go. They had no more government contracts because there was no war to be fought. The government began subsidizing the aircraft industry with huge amounts of money to keep them alive. And you can see the correspondence going back and forth between Stuart Symington, who was Assistant Secretary of the Army at that time. By the way, we didn't have a Secretary of Defense at that time. We had a Secretary of War because we were more honest at that time. But he was the Secretary of the Army. And you see the letters going back and forth from him to the heads of the aircraft companies saying, don't worry, we'll take care of you. And they did. So we have this big government, welfare for the rich, all through American history. In the 20th century, for the first time, as a result of the movements, as a result of the populist movement, the progressive movement, the labor movement, the IWW, the Socialist Party, the labor struggles, the agitation in the country, you begin to get progressive legislation. In the early part of the 20th century, you begin to get regulating of the hours of railroad workers. You begin to get regulation of the railroads a little bit, and you get the Federal Trade Commission set up, which is supposed to stand in the way of too much monopoly and so on. You get the 16th and 17th Amendments, the graduated income tax, popular election of senators. A lot of people don't know that we never elected senators by popular vote until the 20th century. The state legislatures picked the senators for each state. So you had some reforms in the early part of the 20th century. In the New Deal, then come the 30s, and you get more, again, under the influence of enormous agitation all over the country, strikes, unemployed councils, tenants organizations, turmoil, real turmoil all over the country, people marching, people breaking into city halls to demand food. We get New Deal legislation. We get Social Security, we get unemployment insurance, we get subsidized housing, and now the cry goes up, welfare state. And 60s, again, food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid.
WIC.
That's right. And, all of these things for women, for children, and as a result of all of this, there's all this furor about, my God, these welfare people. And not only the Republicans, of course, joining this course, but the Democrats, cowards that they are, retreating in the face of this onslaught, saying, oh, we're against welfare too, We want to cut Medicaid too. We want to cut Medicare. Yeah, we want to do all the things you want to do, just not so much. We like to torture people, but not as badly as you want to do. So it's anyway. As you can see, I could have expanded my column because this is all the things I wanted to say in my column, but I only had 600 words. So and to deal with George Will, I wanted to get something into the op-ed page. But it's in Clinton's last State of the Union message. He said, "The era of big government is over." And I remember the Boston Globe took that out of his State of the Union and put it, in big letters in a box. The era of big government is over. What nonsense. I mean, here they are. They're spending $265 billion for the military budget. That is big government. And it's interesting. All these people who talk about big government, if you mention the military, you said, hey, how about turning this over, privatize the military? Get the government out of the military. If General Motors, if IT&T wants to overthrow a government in Chile, let them do it by themselves. See how they make out. But big government includes the military. So we're in a situation of deep hypocrisy, where both Democrats and Republicans are talking about welfare and big government and trying to really badly mislead the American people. Fortunately, I don't think they're totally succeeding, because I think there is the lessons of the New Deal. It's interesting, even with people who were, didn't live during the New Deal, right? The 30s. I mean, who is still living from the 30s? I'm the only one in America. Maybe 5 other people, right? But most young people, or most middle-aged people, were not around in the 30s. But I think that the legacy of the 30s, the Depression, the legacy of Roosevelt. It's interesting that Roosevelt is invoked by everybody. Even Ronald Reagan said, "I was for Roosevelt," because they don't want to fool with Roosevelt. Because the image of Roosevelt is, we were in a depression. Roosevelt took us out. They don't tell us how Roosevelt took us out. They took us out by big government. Took us out by creating millions of jobs for people. Took us out by deficit spending. Roosevelt did not balance the budget. Roosevelt unbalanced the budget. But here, they're talking about, we must balance the budget. The Republicans say it, and then the Democrats hop on, oh yeah, we must balance the budget. They think that when they say these things, they'll persuade people. And what's interesting to me is that they're not really successful, because there's a deep, I think, understanding in people that the government has to take care of people in need. And when there's a, I don't know, were you at the Mobilization for Survival meeting in Boston, the dinner at the Mobilization for Survival dinner? No, I don't think you were. But
you could recap for us and the audience.
Yeah, but the reason I ask you this is because I think I was speaking then, because of course I speak everywhere. It's impossible to have a meeting, right, without me being there. I think one of the points I made, we always like to quote ourselves, and was that there was an interesting thing that happened after the November 1994 election, with the big, what the newspapers called a Republican sweep, revolution. Amazing, a revolution. 38% of the people who are eligible to vote go to the polls. A little over half of them vote Republican. So 20% vote Republican. It's a revolution. It's overwhelming. It's, the press is so ridiculous, really. But of course it wasn't a revolution. It wasn't overwhelming. And then right after that, the New York Times had a headline based on a survey they took, presumably. The headline said, "Public supports Republican agenda." So I looked down to read, because sometimes you have to read beyond the headlines, and see the results of the survey they took. They asked people, are you in favor of increasing money for welfare? Well, people actually are split, like 46%, 47%. It's not clear at all. Then they asked people, do you think the government should help people in need? 67% say yes, the government should help people in need, which is the opposite of what the Republicans have been saying. We have to get the government out of this. And so you have the headline continuing the myth of, the public wants the Republican agenda, you see. And then the survey itself shows, no, the public has greater sense than this. In fact, if you look at the public opinion surveys of the last 8, 10 years, it's interesting. Public opinion surveys are inherently conservative because, people don't want to be way out when they answer, and they tend to want to answer what's expected of them, And if they're reading in the headlines, everybody wants a balanced budget, and then they're asked by an interrogator, do you think we should have a balanced budget? Yeah, I think we, suddenly it becomes important. But despite this inherent conservatism, these public opinion surveys over these last 8 or 10 years show again and again certain interesting things. One, the public does want the government to help people when people are in need. Two, the government, they believe, should tax the super rich. Overwhelmingly, like 80%, they think the government should have a special tax on millionaires. Now, neither the Republicans nor the Democrats go along with this, of course. The Democrats are as much a government of millionaires as the Republicans. Before all of the debate on, the so-called debate on health care, reform of health care, which, a year or so ago, when they asked the public what health care system they favored, the public, 65% of them said, we're in favor of the Canadian system, the single-payer system, no insurance companies and so on. So interesting, that everybody said, we're against taxation, we don't want higher, right? But when they asked people, would you be willing to pay higher taxes to clean up the environment, people said yes. When they asked people, do you want to pay higher taxes to help education, people say yes. So you have to take a look at these public opinion surveys very, very carefully to see what it is that people want. And what it turns out is that where people are at, despite the barrage of stuff they've been getting, they're way ahead in progressive terms of both the Democratic and Republican parties. I haven't given you much of a chance to ask questions.
You mentioned that
it's called upstaging the interrogator.
Historians often quote famous people. You mentioned that, including yourself, quoting yourself. I'll quote John Dewey, and he poses the question. This is from his book called Experience and Education. Dewey says, "We have the problem of ascertaining how acquaintance with the past may be translated into a potent instrumentality for dealing effectively with the future. We may reject knowledge of the past as the end of education and thereby only emphasize its importance as a means. When we do that, we have a problem that is new in the story of education." And here's the question. How shall the young become acquainted with the past in such a way that the acquaintance is a potent agent in appreciation of the living present?
That's a good question. I didn't know that quote by Dewey. I thought I knew all quotes dealing with history, and no, I don't know that, but I mean, that's what has motivated me in writing and teaching history ever since I began doing it. And that is, how can I teach history? How can I write history in such a way as to have that history be a potent force for the present? Because I didn't enter history in order just to be a scholar who goes into the past and gets lost, never comes out. There are a lot of historians who do that. They go into the archives, you never see them again. Right. I wanted to come out. I wanted to use what I found to deal with the issues of today. And I guess that was because of my own background, because I'd grown up working class conscious, aware of wealth and poverty, been in the Air Force, been in a war, thinking about issues of war. Went down to teach in Atlanta, Spelman College, black community, civil rights movement. My life brought me into situations which gave me very strong political convictions. And I was not going to teach history without having my convictions enter into that history. I wasn't going to teach history that wasn't in some way useful for solving the problems that I had grown up with and that I had witnessed in my life. So, how did I do this? And how can it be done? First of all, by changing the selection of data. History is all the selection of data. It pretends to be objective. It pretends to be thorough. You get a big fat history book, and somehow there's something about the fatness of a history book which suggests completeness. you know, my God, this book has 800 pages. I guess that's all there is, you know. And so there are all these textbooks of 800 pages, and they leave out very, very important things. I mean, they have left out for most of what I say will apply, I might say, to most of American history. That is most of the history of the teaching of history. There have been some changes in recent years, not enough, but some changes. But what I will say applies to what has been generally true in the teaching and the writing of American history. Well, the most obvious thing, and this we've talked about before, is leaving out what Columbus did to the natives of Hispaniola. You know, the kidnapping, the mutilation, the murder, the enslavement, you know, totally left out. I mean, interesting. A democratic country we are, educated country, supposedly pluralistic, having many different kinds of views. No. One view on Columbus, again and again, generation after generation, the heroic view. So, first thing you do is you put in that history. It's there. It was always there. It was always there in the journals of Las Casas. You put it in. You put in the Indian Wars. As soon as you start telling history from an Indian point of view, everything changes. The American Revolution, for instance. How is the American Revolution presented? Well, if the World War II was a good war, the Revolution was another good war, maybe even better. You know, is anybody say anything about against the American Revolution? No, it's a wonderful, glorious thing. The statues of those people are all over this country, you know, there are hundreds of biographies of the founding fathers, right? The American Revolution, great. From the Indian point of view, American Revolution was not a good thing, because the British, when they owned the American colonies, set a line. The Proclamation of 1763 set a line, said, you can't go west of this line. This is Indian territory. Because the British didn't want to have trouble with the Indians. You know, they had enough trouble with everybody else. They don't have trouble with the Indians. Well, of course, the American colonists, they are big land speculators. I'm not talking about small farmers or poor people who want to go west and find a bit of land. I'm talking about the huge landowners of Virginia who want to move into the Carolinas, you know, west. And American Revolution gets rid of the British, gets rid of the Proclamation of 1763. Now it's open territory. And for the next 100 years, you know, right? Almost exactly for the next 100 years, the American government is engaged in a war of extermination of the Indians. And those wars, those battles, are left out of American history, except for a few high points, right? I mean, Custer's last stand, but those massacres that took place during the Civil War, you know, the removal of the Indians from the southeast, from Georgia, the removal of the Choctaws and the Cherokees and the Creek Indians from the southeast, the movement across the Mississippi after they discover gold in Georgia. It's always after they discover gold somewhere, right? They discover oil in Oklahoma. The Indians can't have a little piece of Oklahoma, piece that was left to them after they've been driven out of every place else there, squeezed into a little part of Oklahoma. And that part of Oklahoma was called, on the map, Indian Territory. And they thought, well, at least we have this. You know, we have this, Indian Territory. Then they discover oil in the Indian Territory in the early 20th century. That's the end of Indian Territory. The removal of the Indians from the southeast, the Trail of Tears. When I went to school, and not only when I went to school, when everybody in this country went to school, generation to generation, that whole story of the Indian removal left out. Andrew Jackson, another, like a Columbus figure. Columbus is a hero, Andrew Jackson is a hero. Arthur Schlesinger, you know, eminent historian, writes The Age of Jackson. You know, and what is Jackson in that? He's a New Dealer before the New Deal. He's the common, the president of the common man, et cetera, et cetera. He fought the National Bank. What Schlesinger doesn't tell us is the other side of Jackson. Jackson, the slave owner. Jackson, the racist. Jackson, the Indian killer. Jackson, vicious person. Jackson, who's ordered his postmaster general to cooperate with the South in keeping abolitionist literature out of the mail so that no abolition literature could use federal mails to go into the South. Federal government cooperating with the Southern slave owners under Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson making sure the United States gets Florida by military raids into Florida. This is before he became president. So that then it appears on the map as Florida Purchase. It's like a commercial transaction. No, it wasn't Florida Purchase, it was Florida Conquest. That part of Andrew Jackson left out of the history books. And you can go on and on, and the things that are left out. The exploitation of labor in American history, the period between the Civil War and the World War I, period of the great industrial revolution in America, because what the Civil War did, aside from freeing the slaves, or as more accurately, semi-freeing the slaves, the Civil War was fought mainly not to free the slaves. Just as World War II was not fought mainly to help the Jews, right? The Civil War was not fought mainly to free. The Civil War was fought been fought mainly from the point of view of the slaves to free the slaves, mainly from the point of view of the abolitionists, but they weren't in power. From the point of view of the people in power, Civil War was fought to keep one huge market, South and North together, united for economic expansion. And after the Civil War, that expansion went ahead, full speed. The railroads, the banks, the industries, the mines, along, of course, with the removal of the Indians so that all this could happen. You see. And I remember when I went to school, high school, even college, even graduate school. You think, oh, graduate school, now you're really going to get this truth. No. Graduate school, you get the same stuff you get in elementary school. Only more complicated on a higher level, more footnotes, right? If they gave footnotes in elementary school, you'd think you were in graduate school. So I learned this was a wonderful period. This is when America became a world power. I remember being thrilled when they presented the statistics, all the railroad, miles of railroad being laid, the transcontinental railroad. I remember, in class learning about the meeting of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, and the president driving a golden spike in to, what a wonderful, what they left out. Who worked on those railroads? Chinese immigrants, Irish immigrants, working 14 hours a day, dying in the heat, dying in the cold, dying of disease. That's what they left out. They left out who was working in Rockefeller's oil refineries, who was working in Carnegie's steel mills. They left out the great labor struggles. The railroad strikes of 1877. They did put in, there's always a little tokenism, right? By the way, with Columbus, there was no tokenism. Jackson, no tokenism, nothing negative. With labor struggles, yes, they put in the Pullman strike of 1894. They always got that in there. Why? Because Debs was involved. And because Debs later became a presidential candidate, and we mustn't ignore presidential elections, because this is a big, cultural, important thing in America, presidential election. So, but the Haymarket Affair, 1886, the execution of the anarchists, the trumping up of charges against the anarchists, the no evidence against them, that they threw the bomb which killed the policeman, right? The Haymarket Affair, I don't remember learning in my history courses about Haymarket. So how much did they teach me about the IWW? 2 lines maybe. So if on a multiple choice test, if I came across IWW, I could connect it with Big Bill Haywood, But, so, you know, that the Dewey question leads to a whole new book on American history, which I've started to give you, and obviously we don't have enough time, right, to do a whole book, but left out, what's left out, and you know, I could go on and on and on about what has been left out in the traditional teaching of American history. When I was teaching at Spelman College, I became more aware of what was left out in black history. Interestingly enough, when I came to Spelman College, which was a black women's college, I discovered there was no course in black history, or even in Negro history. No course. There was a one-year required course for history majors in the history of England. History of England. I still remember coming into my classroom, my first classroom at Spelman College, where the previous teacher had on the board a diagram, filled the whole board, of the succession of the Tudor dynasty and the Stuart dynasty. You know, who came first, James first or Charles first? You might ask the question, who came first, James first or James second? Like, and no course in black history. I began reading black historians for the first time. By the way, talk about omission. Nowhere in any of my historical training up through the graduate school, PhD at Columbia, nowhere in that historical training did a black historian ever appear on my reading list. Even John Hope Franklin. I don't remember him being on there. And he was sort of the dean and the most respectable of American black historians. When I began to read black historians, I began to read a historian named Rayford Logan, who was teaching at Howard University, who wrote a book called The Betrayal. And what was that book about? It was about that period in American history which is called the Progressive Period. It's interesting. The Progressive Period, early 20th century, these reforms that I spoke about. So it's called the Progressive Period. Rayford Logan writes about it. It's not the Progressive Period, it's the Great Betrayal, because what is omitted in the history of the Progressive Period, where they're giving the history of all those reforms, what's omitted is that exactly in that period of reform, the Progressive Period, more black people are lynched than in any other period in American history. More race riots. I mean, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 200 black people are massacred by a combination of police, National Guard, and Army. I mean, these things never appeared in my history books. Sure, lynching, vaguely lynching, lynching. But the reality of lynching, of telling you about a specific incident, about the race riots in Springfield or here or there, no, they weren't there. Well, I'll stop before you stop me. Okay.
Professor, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've noticed a curious rewriting of history by the consensus press and the culture in general. Topics like the Black Panthers, Communist Party USA, the anarchist and socialist movements you briefly mentioned a little while ago, unions, the Woodstock celebration in 1969. All these are being rewritten in the mass culture in a way that I don't think really reflects honestly what actually happened. Can you comment on that? And perhaps the most egregious rewriting of history, the celebration about Richard Nixon?
Yeah, it's sad that Oliver Stone should participate in that kind of rewriting of Richard Nixon's role, because the main negative thing that comes across about Nixon in Oliver Stone's film, and we have to mention films in the rewriting of history, because many, many more Americans get their history through films than get their history through books or newspapers or anything. And so, sure, millions of people will see the Nixon film. And the worst thing that it seems about Nixon is that he was a drunkard, his personal characteristics. And what is left what is left out is COINTELPRO. What is left out? You talk about the Black Panthers, and the vicious campaign against the Black Panthers, against the Socialist Workers' Party, against the New Left, the FBI violations of law, FBI break-ins, the FBI inciting to suicide of Martin Luther King. I mean, all these things that are going on, under Nixon, none of this appears in this film. In fact, it's going on also under J. Edgar Hoover, but we're sort of accustomed to that with J. Edgar Hoover, you see. But it's interesting that in his brief portrayal of J. Edgar Hoover in the film, what is the thing that you notice about J. Edgar Hoover? What is the most important thing about J. Edgar Hoover? He's a homosexual. He's making a pass at a waiter. Hey, is that all you can say about J. Edgar Hoover? One of the most monstrous figures in American history. All the lives that were ruined by J. Edgar Hoover, or the racism of J. Edgar Hoover, the things he did, not only just against Martin Luther King, the role of the FBI in the South, but leaving out history, leaving out and talking about Nixon, the bombing of Cambodia, leaving out the great Christmas bombing in '72, while the presumably peace negotiations are still going on. And then talk about the rewriting of history. Nixon dies. Nothing so much stimulates the rewriting of history as a death and a funeral service and the speeches that have to be made at a funeral service. Because what happens, everybody is suddenly sending telegrams from all over the world. Oh my God, Nixon, what a great man. And President Clinton gets up, talk about contributing to the rewriting of history. President Clinton gets up at the memorial service of Nixon and says, and this is very close to an exact quote. I don't have the quote in front of me because I don't want it in front of me, And but Clinton said, that Nixon all his life fought for freedom and justice. I had to read that twice, but these, suddenly people become invested with a beatitude which they didn't have in real life. But rewriting of history, there's certain images that are created by the press. The Black Panthers, violent. Last night we heard this former Black Panther talk. What was his job? He was head of social services for the Black Panthers in Brooklyn. He was in charge of making sure that kids had something to eat and taking care of people and fighting the drug problem and so on. The Black Panthers did a lot of that work, aside from the fact that they armed themselves in self-defense against what they thought was police brutality. I say what they thought because we know the police are never brutal, right? The Black Panthers had this notion that the police carried arms and the police might use it against black people, which of course they did when they killed Black Panthers in Chicago in December of 1969. So rewriting of the history of Black Panthers, rewriting of the history of the radical movements in this country, rewriting of the 60s. I remember seeing not long ago a television program on the 60s, a documentary on the 60s. And what seemed to me to pervade the documentary and was the 60s as a period of drugs and wild, crazy people. Actually, the same picture that was given in Forrest Gump, talking again about films having a great effect. More is the picture of Forrest Gump. They have this Abby Hoffman figure getting up and saying things like, fuck everybody. This is, these are the people of the 60s, these obscene, crazy people, and oh yes, and that very nice girl, his girlfriend, you know, who is her lover, her 60s lover, some druggy, SDS violent, you know, so the rewriting of the 60s, the rewriting of the Panthers, and of course the, you know, it's going on again and again. The rewriting of the Vietnam War, you know, and where you ask young people today, have you heard of the My Lai massacre? No. Really? They never heard of the My Lai massacre, you know. So how did the Vietnam War come across? You know, some people even think, well, some people think we won. Or other people think we lost, but we should have won because we didn't use all the power we had. We fought with one hand tied behind our backs, which is very funny. Very funny. One hand tied behind our backs, you know. We send 2 million guys over there. At any one time, there are 525,000 guys over there, but 2 million went back and forth, you know. The greatest air force in the world, dropping more tons of bombs than it dropped in World War II, you know, leaving the country with 20 million bomb craters, you know, one for every family in Vietnam, really. One hand tied behind our back, you know. Killing 2 million Vietnamese, not enough. We could have won if we had killed 2 million more. Well, anyway, so yeah, this we have this rewriting of history goes on. That's why we badly need more people doing the kind of history that John Dewey asked us to do, going into the past in such a way as to really illuminate in a good way, you know, the issues of the present. And I want to say something encouraging, because since I've been saying so many discouraging things, there are more teachers today. Not enough, but there are more teachers today in the elementary schools and high schools who are beginning to teach history in a different way. For the first time since the Columbus issue became an issue in 1992, which was the first time that, you know, we've had all these Columbus days, but in 1992 with the quincentennial, it was the first time that an issue was made. It was an issue made by Native Americans, by historians, by, you know, and Bill Bigelow out on the West Coast and going around the country talking to teachers. Now we have thousands of teachers, I think it's fair to say thousands of teachers around the country who are teaching Columbus in a different way. Now we have many more teachers around. I know because I've met hundreds of them myself. If I've met hundreds, I figure there must be thousands. Thousands of teachers who are teaching history in a different way. Well take my book. I'm sorry to mention my book. Okay, A People's History of the United States. 400,000 copies sold by now. I don't know how many of those copies are sold in classrooms. Half, even if it's a third. It means that, well, I know it's, you know, it's hundreds because I get letters from all over the country from teachers who are using my book. I'm always, you know, last night I was at this meeting, right? Students come up to me afterwards and say, I read your book in high school. Well, my teacher's using your book now, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a new CD-ROM. I don't want to mention only my book, you know, how self-indulgent, you know. But of course, when I try to think of another book that does just that, I, of course, being oblivious to what other people do. No, but there's a CD-ROM based on a book, Who Built America, which is a textbook which is good, which puts in a lot of stuff about working people that was not in our traditional books. And that book has had a fairly wide circulation. There's a CD-ROM about it, which is being sent out around the country. So there are good signs. In fact, it's a good sign that the right wing is so upset about what they call political correctness, right? I mean, why is all this fuss about political correctness or about multicultural education. They're upset because things have changed in the teaching of history, and people are reading I, Rigoberto Menchu, and people are reading things that horrify the guardians of the old canon.
I'm going to continue by quoting another famous person, less famous in mainstream circles than Dewey, Kropotkin, and from his An Appeal to the Young. He says this: when young, who has not dreamed that one day he would apply his intelligence, his abilities, his knowledge to help on the enfranchisement of those who today grovel in misery and in ignorance? Let us see what you must do to make your dream a reality. And he asked the question, what is to be done? So I ask you, what is to be done?
Well, let me just start from Kropotkin's Appeal to the Young, which is a wonderful essay, which really is an appeal to the young. And he's saying in this essay, he's saying, look, I know you got to, I'm paraphrasing Kropotkin, of course. I don't remember exactly his words, okay? Forgive me. But he's, as I recall his essay, he is saying to the young, look, I know you want jobs. I know you're going to be engineers, you're going to be teachers, you're going to be doctors, you're going to be scientists, you're going to be this, you're going to be that. Okay, that's all right, but be more than that. Be a doctor who takes care of the poor. Be a lawyer who defends the poor. Be a scientist who changes the environment to help the poor. I mean, Kropotkin was an environmentalist, long before anybody else almost, and he talks in that quote you gave me about the idealism, the natural idealism of the young, which I found to be true. In the 1980s, I was teaching at Boston University, and the Reagan era, and it's interesting. I just thought, there's the Jackson era, there's the Roosevelt era. We really have a Reagan era? Is Reagan really going to attach his name to an era? Yes, probably. There's a Reagan era in which I taught, in which everybody was saying, the new conservatism in the country. They always characterize the country by who's on top. It's like they characterize the state of the economy by the Dow Jones average. The Dow Jones average got up. Everybody's doing better. Tell that to people who are unemployed. The young in the 1980s are being characterized, the students are being characterized as conservative, passive, uncaring, the me generation. Isn't that what they said? They're only concerned about themselves. I was teaching classes of, every semester in the 1980s, I was teaching a class of 400 students, just a small group, 400 students. I say this to indicate that I wasn't teaching a little group of radicals. The 400 students were a fair cross-section of students at Boston University. There were not 400 student radicals at Boston University, I assure you. There were students who were studying engineering, students who were studying journalism, students from the business school. I had students from all over the university who took my course. It was very clear. These students were interested in the social issues of the day. All you had to do was bring it up, and you would see. They cared. I had discussions with my students all the time about the important issues of the day in the Reagan era, about should the government help people? What should be done? Should we invade Grenada? Should we build up a military? All these issues came up. The students were interested. They cared. They cared about the military budget. They cared about the possibility of war. They cared about the distribution of wealth. They cared about racism, really, in the 80s. Because students, young people do have a, I believe, I mean, I taught for 30, I don't know how many years I taught. At least, yeah, 30 years. And there's no doubt in my mind, students, young people have a basic idealism. It can be driven out of them, or it can be pushed to the side, or it can be ignored if you don't ask them the questions, if you don't talk to them about these things. But, I mean, last night we were at this meeting at Harvard, a meeting on capital punishment. How many people are interested in capital punishment? Only those people who are going to die? Only the families of the... No. There was this big lecture hall, and as I walked towards the lecture hall, I couldn't get in, right? There's this mob of students going into the place was jammed. People sitting on the floor, people sitting on the windows, people in the aisles, people sitting on the stage. These young people, they weren't just from Harvard, they were from other, they cared. They care about capital punishment. It doesn't affect them personally. You know, during the Vietnam War, they say, oh, well, there's a anti-war movement because the kids don't want to be drafted. Nonsense. There were all sorts of young people who were ineligible for the draft who were in the anti-war movement. Older people who didn't have kids eligible in the anti-war movement. All sorts of people in the anti-war movement. Because people are not just selfish creatures, although they won't like us to think of that. People care, and young people care. So what is to be done? What is to be done is to take advantage of this idealism, take advantage, to make use of it, to organize it. And not because what was happening in the 80s is the idealism of students didn't have a way of being organized. There was no great movement like the civil rights movement to occupy, center their attention. There was no great anti-war movement in the 80s. When there was an issue that came up, students did get involved. They got involved in the anti-apartheid movement, you know, getting the universities to divest from, you know, stocks in South Africa. Students got interested in Central America and military aid to El Salvador, death squads in El Salvador. And there was this student organizations all over the country on the issue of Central America. So what is to be done is to take advantage of this, I think, natural idealism in students and organize it. At the meeting last night, the people who organized that meeting knew what they were doing. They didn't just have a meeting where people were speaking. They were organizing. They were raising money from these students. They were handing out membership cards. Join our organization. Join the organization against capital punishment. They were making announcements. This meeting is taking place. This thing is going on. This is when it's happening. Well, in the United States today, 1996, you always have to remind a historian what year it is. He's usually like a decade behind, you know. And there's a great potential in the United States for social change. You know, you wouldn't know it by listening to the Democrats or Republicans. Well, you would know it by seeing how many people don't give a damn about the Democrats and Republicans. You'd know it by seeing how many people go to the polls, they don't care, how many people vote unenthusiastically, how even the public opinion surveys show that more people consider themselves independents now than Democrats or Republicans. The potential is there. It needs to be organized, it needs to be galvanized, needs to be stimulated. That's what is to be done. I'm going to have to...
Okay. You have to stop?
Well, maybe 5 or 10 minutes at the moment. Do you want 5 or 10 minutes, or...?
Sure, you're on a roll.
Oh.
Yeah,
All right, 5 or 10 minutes.
Right.
Hold on, wait.
A little while ago, a lot was made of D-Day in this country, and they supposedly said that D-Day was very popular around the globe, that everyone was celebrating the United States being involved in the Second World War. I mean, the papers were filled with it, the magazines were filled with it, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's 1996, as you just mentioned a little while ago. Do you expect there's going to be that much celebration of the Americans who went over to help Spain during the Spanish Civil War, in terms of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and others?
Yeah. I know that question is a joke. Well, yeah, of course. Nobody, no, there's not going to be the kind of celebration of 1936, the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, and the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, who were, well, yes, began to fight fascism because it was fascism, and not just because one of our colonies was bombed. I mean, after all, that's when the United States began to fight. Oh, sure, we were helping England before that with sending them munitions, but we didn't really get into the war until our colony was bombed. A lot of people forget that Pearl Harbor was our colony. You know, they act as if San Francisco was bombed. Well, I know there's going to be, I notice some celebration in New York for the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and I see where Joan Baez is going to be there, I think, and some Hollywood people, what's Susan Sarandon is going to be there, and people like that, and so there will be people who still remember and the people who are concerned, but no, it won't be celebrated as much, of course, although it should be, because as I say, these people, they were not drafted, they were not fighting for a government, they were not reacting to an attack on a colony, they were reacting to the attempt of fascists in Spain, supported by Italy and Germany, by Mussolini and Hitler, to destroy what had been really the first democratic Popular Front government in Spain. And, 3,000 went over, 1,500 came back. 50% casualty rate. In the United States, we lost a lot of people in World War II. Nobody has a 50% casualty rate. So they were a very, very special, heroic, remarkable group, and what they did should certainly be celebrated, and that should appear in the history books.
This could take a long time, but could you briefly reminisce about your friendship with Daniel Berrigan, which you mentioned in your recent book, You Can't Remain Neutral on a Moving Train?
My friendship with Daniel Berrigan. I'll tell you this, I'll do it in reverse chronological order, just to confuse everything. In May, there's going to be a celebration in New York of his 75th birthday, and a lot of people are coming. My wife and I are coming, because we're both friends of his. I got to know him in early 1968 when we flew to Hanoi to pick up those first 3 airmen, prisoners of war released by the North Vietnamese, and we've been friends ever since. And then we became involved in both of us and together, various things in the anti-war movement. He did much more heroic things than I did. He went to jail again and again, and I visited him in Danbury prison. My wife did too, and we have a nice picture on our wall of they take those prison photographers. They always have this guy in prison going around taking pictures of the prisoner and the visitors, so he's a wonderful person. He's a wonderful poet. Because people know him as an activist, they forget what they don't know about. They're not told about his poetry. A wonderful poet. And one of the great people of our time. I mean, if there were talk about heroes being celebrated, if people were really being celebrated, Dan Berrigan and so many others like him in the Catholic anti-war movement, in the Christian left, I say this deliberately, not to exclude anybody else, but because I didn't realize, that, well, I didn't realize because it wasn't there, that the Catholic Church, that there were people in the Catholic Church who had become militant, radical, anti-war, civil rights, courageous, heroic, sacrificing people. Anyway, yeah, Daniel Berrigan represents something, very noble in the history of this country. Someday it'll be recognized.